Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's right about noon. We'll probably have some more folks come in as we get started, but I want to go ahead and get us rolling here. My name is Carol Easterly, and I am one of the museum program coordinators here at the Kentucky Historical Society. Just want to thank you for being with us today. I'm really excited to welcome our speaker today. It's a great opportunity for us at the Historical Society to really highlight some of the research and the teaching that's really timely and helpful and happening right here in the Commonwealth. So I kind of love that. Before we get started, just a few reminders about Zoom, this new fun technological wonder that we're all dealing with so much lately. Please do just remember to keep your microphone on mute throughout the program so we don't have any noise interruptions. You are most welcome to keep your video camera on if you would like to. It's nice to see everyone's face and smile. Just remember we can see you though. And as the program's happening, do please type your questions and your comments into the chat feature. You're welcome to do that as the program is going on. If you think of something that you want to add there, and then we'll save the questions for the end. But if you go on and type those in, then I'll be able to share those with Dr. Dupont. So let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to see everything on my screen here. But yeah, our speaker today, as you know, is Dr. Carolyn Dupont, and she's going to be sharing with us about the history of the Electoral College. I could say a lot about the current election environment that we find ourselves in. I won't because I might cry, but one of the things that I hope comes out of this presentation today is that it kind of helps us cut through the noise a little bit, because we certainly have been hearing lots about the Electoral College, and that's only going to continue for the next 30 days and maybe even intensify. And so I do hope that Dr. Dupont's presentation will help us to kind of cut through some of that with accurate information. So just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Dupont, she got both her MA and her PhD at the University of Kentucky, and she has been on the faculty at Eastern Kentucky University since 2009 and won numerous awards for her teaching there, and she's written and published extensively. This is actually kind of a newer area of research for her. She's published mostly on the relationship between Southern white Christianity and civil rights movement, which is very interesting, and I'm going to have to come and talk to her about presenting on that sometime at KHS. I actually just recently saw her quoted in an NPR article about that, which was really cool. She's also taught at UK, at Transylvania and Berea at different times, as well as through the Kentucky Governor's Scholars Program and the Kentucky Institute for International Studies as well. So she's in demand, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today. She is a member of the Kentucky Humanities Council Speakers Bureau, and so that's how I was able to connect with her. And so I do want to make sure to thank the Humanities Council as well as their sponsors for their very generous support of this and so many other wonderful programs throughout the state. And so I think we've probably got just about everybody here. I'll continue to let folks in as we go on. But without further ado, please take it away, Dr. Dupont. Oh, I've got to unmute you. Hang on. There we go. There, you're good.
Carol, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to sharing this presentation about the Electoral College. And my goal here is just really to inform us about the history of the Electoral College. Carol, I don't have my screen up, even though I have shared it. Can you?
All right, let's see.
Lisa, or do I need to reshare it?
I think reshare it. Yeah, try that.
Okay. Yes.
All right, can we see her screen?
There we go. Okay, now, so I'd like to begin. So it's not, my slides are not advancing. There we go. With the words of one of the framers of the Constitution, the election of a president of the United States is no longer that process which the Constitution contemplated. These are the words of Senator Rufus King, whom I'm assuming most of us have never heard of. And he spoke these words in March of 1816, at which time he was a US Senator from New York. But he had been a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, so one of the framers of the Constitution and a very active participant in the process that produced the Constitution. And in fact, of the 55 men who convened to write that document, many of them, we don't see them taking a really active role in speaking a great deal, but Rufus King actually contributed quite a bit. And so beginning with his words, I want to talk just briefly about the arguments about the origins of the Electoral College that tend to dominate our conversation these days. On the one hand, and more from people who are conservative say that the Electoral College was created to avoid the tyranny of the majority, to create an election of the president that wouldn't allow the majority to lord it over everybody else. Folks who are a little bit more left-leaning say, oh, the framers were elitist and they wanted to thwart democracy. They didn't really want democracy. And that's why they created the Electoral College. Well, the truth is that the sources don't support either one of these arguments in terms of the origins of the Electoral College. And in fact, on the one hand, you could argue that the origins may not matter because the Electoral College has not worked the way that the framers designed it to for over 2 centuries. So my driving point today is simply that the Electoral College today works very differently from the one envisioned by the framers and described in the US Constitution. And to establish this, I am going to talk a little bit about the creation of the Electoral College, and to the extent that I can, take you in the room where it happened. And we're going to look at the conversation around the Electoral College and the process whereby they created it. And I will say, I can't bring in every factor, but I'm going to bring in the ones that are salient for our discussion. Then we're going to look very briefly at how it changed and why it changed. And I probably should have also added there when it changed, even though that's a little imprecise. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about how the Electoral College operates today. So that's where we're going. So we have to begin with the origins, which are, of course, in the creation of the US Constitution. And I don't know how much members of the audience know about the creation of the Constitution, but let me just say very briefly that it was a process of about 4 months from roughly June 1st to September 17th, 1787. And I often find that we have a tendency to endow this process with kind of a holiness, that this was a moment where the framers were in their wisdom, spewing wise aphorisms and talking about the truths that they understood. Well, the truth is that they came into it with a lot of different ideas. It wasn't just one idea about really anything that they agreed on. And their ideas played off of one another and several times almost broke down completely, the convention that wrote the Constitution. And the whole process almost got aborted. So what I like to say is that they didn't have a common vision about how to choose the chief executive, but they really didn't have a common vision about very much at all. And so just to zero in on this topic of how to choose the chief executive, and let me just say that this is only one of the many, many topics that they are having to deal with. They're trying to figure out the structure of Congress and what the powers of Congress would be, the composition of the chief executive. There was even brief talk about having 3 executives. So just to narrow in on just this one question of how to choose the chief executive, they actually discussed it on 21 different days and took 30 distinct votes on various aspects of simply how to make the choice. Not the powers, not the composition, but just various aspects of how we might choose a chief executive. Both the Virginia plan, as many of you will know, that's the idea that the Virginia delegation formulated before the convention ever started. And that became sort of the working, shall we say, the working draft for the convention. And the New Jersey plan, which was the alternative presented by the small states, both of those plans actually called for the president to be chosen by Congress. And this probably made some sense at the time, given that governors were chosen this way in 10 of the states. And throughout most of the summer, the framers worked with the model of having Congress choose the chief executive. So that was kind of their working plan, and they kept coming back to it. Now, there are clear advantages to having Congress choose the chief executive, and that would be that the members of Congress would be in a good position to know and assess the character of potential candidates. They would likely have worked with potential candidates before, have good insight into their character and their experience. But I bet all of you are already thinking, oh, this is a bad idea, and that you're immediately seeing why it's a bad idea. And this was what kept tripping them up. It would be rife with corruption, that there would be a kind of improper relationship established between the executive and Congress if Congress were to choose him. And there are so many different times that they talk about this potential for corruption, and so many different members of the convention weigh in on it. But I just pulled a quote out here that's sort of representative. This one by Gouverneur Morris, and no, that is not a misspelling of governor. His name was Gouverneur. He said, if the legislature elect, it will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. He will be the mere creature of the legislature if appointed and impeachable by that body. So this is the bind that they're in. They're not really satisfied with the choice of Congress, but they keep coming back to it. So looking a little closer into their conversation, what are the other things that they say about Congress choosing the chief executive? How could he maintain independence? This hinged in part on questions of re-eligibility. So perhaps you could get a somewhat uncorrupt choice the first time around, but if the president were eligible for re-election, this would certainly compromise that choice. It would compromise his behavior while in office, because he'd be working with a view only to please those who would re-elect him. And of course, if you're then going to decide that the president can't be reelected, it impinges on questions of the length of his term. And so what they actually ended up deciding and kept going back to for most of this almost 4-month period was that Congress would choose the president. He would not be eligible for reelection, but he would serve a 7-year term. And there are other modes of choosing the chief executive that are thrown out, and these are discussed often because, as I've already noted, no one is really happy with this idea of Congress choosing the chief executive. And some of these other modes include popular election, and I'll talk in a minute about what they said about that. And even with popular election, there are a variety of considerations that come into play. There are in a variety of ways you could do popular election, but there's even a proposal that each person would actually vote for 3 candidates. There is also the possibility that the people would vote and that Congress would choose from, say, the highest 3 or 4 vote getters. And of course, I probably should remind the audience at this point that there's no party system in place as the Constitution is being written, and the framers don't envision a party system. Of course, there will be one emerge very, very shortly after, and even in fact, in the ratification process for the Constitution, but it's not in their minds that there would be a party system, and certainly not a 2-party system. Then there is the idea of a system of electors, with electors chosen by the people. But I want to point out that this is also regarded as a form of popular election when it's discussed. It's mediated election by the people is how some of them describe it. There's also the possibility of the governors electing the president. And believe it or not, once when they really get frustrated, they say, oh, heck, let's just draw straws. So it's really quite a wide-ranging discussion about the possibilities. When it comes to the question of popular election, there's actually a lot of support for popular election. And we can count probably around 7 or 8 of the principal framers. But when I say principal, I'm talking of about the 12 or 15 who actually do the most talking. I don't know any other way to say it, whose statements we have recorded, who voiced support for popular election at one point or another. And these would include, again, Gouverneur Morris, who says at one point he ought to be elected by the people at large, by the freeholders of the country. If the people should elect, they will never fail to prefer some man of distinguished character or services, some man of continental reputation. And of course, this is what they want, is a man, of course, now we would say a person, but a man at the time of distinguished character and service, someone with a continental reputation. James Madison also supports popular election. He says that the people at large is the fittest in itself. But not everyone supports popular election. There are objections. But I think it's useful for us to see what those objections were. And I'll offer here the statements of 2 framers on this issue. Of course, there are others, but they all fall in this vein. Roger Sherman of Connecticut says that they will never, meaning the people, will never be sufficiently informed of characters. In other words, the people can't really know the qualities of the potential candidates. And we get insight from George Mason as to why they believed that ordinary folks couldn't really know the qualities of the potential candidates. Mason says that the extent of the country or the size of the country renders it impossible that the people can have requisite capacity to judge of the respective pretensions of the candidates. And so we see here that Mason is not suggesting that people are stupid or not capable of making good decisions, but that because we live in this large country where information is largely local, where newspapers are in their infant stage, that there's not really a means for people to have knowledge of the candidates. And I want to underscore here that 18th century knowledge about political leaders is highly local. And we think of some of the most well-known framers names that we're all familiar with today, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, or Thomas Jefferson. In fact, they didn't really have a national reputation at the time that the Constitution is written. Only George Washington can claim a national reputation. These men had been players in state politics or colonial politics, and they were well known in their home states, but there hadn't really been a national body with any kind of an authority until we got the Continental Congress. And even then, once there was a Declaration of Independence and we were governed under the Articles of Confederation, authority was in the states, sovereignty was in the states. And so people just don't really have a very broad acquaintance with men outside their states. And so I want to just underscore that it's really, this is the central concern. And I want to note here that reasons that they reject popular election are reasons that are never mentioned for rejecting popular election. They never mention the tyranny of the majority. And I want to just point this out because there is an argument that's circulating today that that's why the Electoral College was created. And there is just no source for that in the documents that tell us about, that take us in the room when the Constitution was framed. And in fact, that word, the tyranny of the majority, I believe is never used by any framer except for John Adams, any founder except for John Adams. And John Adams was not actually even in in the United States when the Constitution was written. He was serving as minister to Great Britain. And then the other reason that is never mentioned for rejecting popular election is anything having to do with the people being stupid and their will needing to be subverted. So let's talk about the plans for an electoral college and what they look like when they're presented. So on 3 different occasions, someone within the Constitutional Convention proposes an electoral college, and all of these electoral college plans look different, but they are all rejected. And each time the delegates vote them down and return to the original plan of having Congress choose the president. So I think that's important to note because it dispels this idea that they come into the convention believing that there's some superiority in an electoral college. And in fact, you know, in terms of electoral colleges that they would be familiar with, the only one that is used in the United States at the time is the state of Maryland chooses its senators by means of electors. And they actually don't even call it electoral colleges, but they use electors to make these choices. But so this is not a device that is being used a lot in the early United States. They finally do accept an electoral college plan on July 19th. So just to kind of refresh you, this would be, you know, about halfway through. That's on the fourth proposal. But lo and behold, they changed their mind 5 days later and returned to the original plan of Congress choosing the president. So then in August, as they're looking toward the end and completing a draft of the Constitution and trying to tie up loose ends, they take 2 more votes on various electoral college proposals. They reject one and the vote is tied on another one of these plans. So it's no wonder that Elbridge Gerry of Connecticut, you know, kind of throws up his hands at one point in all this and says, oh, we seem to be entirely at a loss on this head. And that is a kind of a way of saying on this subject. We don't know what to do. We don't have a good plan. Nobody really seems satisfied with Congress choosing president, but yet that's what they had continued to return to. Now, I don't suppose there's ever going to be a movie made about the creation of the Electoral College in the Constitutional Convention. But if there were, I know what would be the climax of that movie. Where would be the high point, the moment where everything changes. And what happens on August the 31st is that the delegates are going through a draft copy of the Constitution with the provisions that they've agreed on. And they're taking those elements that they haven't settled yet and referring them to a committee. It's called the Committee on Unfinished Parts. And so they're reading through it. And at this point, the issue of the choice of the chief executive has been decided. It's going to be, Congress is going to be choosing the chief executive. But as they're reading through, good old Gouverneur Morris, once again, rises and moves, puts out a motion to strike the provision for Congress to choose the president and to insert in its place this point of choosing the president not yet being finally determined. In other words, he says, let's refer this to the Committee on Unfinished Parts. And that motion passes overwhelmingly. And what I think we can read into the fact that the motion passes overwhelmingly is that the delegates were very dissatisfied with the idea of Congress choosing the president, but they just hadn't settled on an alternative that they were satisfied with. So the whole matter is handed over to a committee on unfinished business. I said unfinished parts a few minutes ago. It goes by both names. It actually is also called the Brierley Committee for the New Jersey delegate who chaired it. It had 1 member from each of the 11 states then present. And they work out something approximating the Electoral College that's described in the Constitution there in the committee. However, once they bring it back to the whole convention, they make even more revisions. So they still were not satisfied. And in the last 10 days before the Constitution was finally signed on September 17th, they make the final provisions to the Electoral College. Now, I want to then underscore what all of this tells us, and that is this: that the Electoral College, the framers did not agree to an Electoral College. It wasn't just, oh, an Electoral College is the way to do it, because they had rejected a number of Electoral College proposals. They agreed to the Electoral College, or a very specific Electoral College that worked in a certain way. So it's not that an Electoral College is superior, but they do agree to the one that they have created with these specific features. And in order to understand what they agree to, I want to talk a moment about what they believe they're doing. What they believe that they're doing is putting the choice of the chief executive in the hands of persons with appropriate knowledge, judgment, and experience. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to ensure a good choice. And there are many places where they talk about this. We want somebody with the appropriate knowledge, the appropriate experience, but we also want this person chosen in an atmosphere free of corruption and improper influence. If the framers agreed about one thing, it was that all people were corruptible. And they understood that you could create a climate where corruption would thrive and where it would be more likely, but that you could also create a climate to minimize and to diminish corruption. And just to demonstrate, to support this point, I wanted to show you the words of John Jay, who describes, and who in fact was not at the Constitutional Convention, but in defending the Constitution in the state of New York, described the Electoral College as a select assembly deputed by the people for the express purpose of electing the president. And then we could take the words of Alexander Hamilton. Probably the most famous explanation of the Electoral College is his explanation in Federalist 68, where he says, it was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the situation and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, favorable to making a good choice, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations. So, what are the features of the framers' Electoral College? And you can read this yourself in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, and in fact, I hope you will, after we depart today, read what the framers provided for. So their Electoral College said, first of all, that the states would decide the manner of choosing electors, and we'll talk in a minute about the various ways that states have chosen electors. But I want to just remind you also that the word elector is acquired as sort of in a specific meaning in our minds, but it's simply an 18th century word for voter. They referred to us, the voters, as electors very frequently. They also provided that no one serving in the federal government at the time could serve as an elector. Well, why was this important? Well, it was to prevent corruption. And Hamilton comments on this, that they, the framers, have excluded from eligibility to this trust or to the office of elector all who from situation might be suspected of too great devotion to the president in office. The electors were not to meet all in the same place, and they were very deliberate about this. Some of those earlier versions of the Electoral College that they rejected assumed that the electors would all meet in one place. But in fact, when they realized that they could separate them, they thought that this would cut down on the ability to collaborate and to conspire. And so Gouverneur Morris again said that he's explaining now the conversation, Morris was a participant obviously, that they would vote at the same time and at so great a distance from each other, the great evil of cabal was avoided. It would be impossible to corrupt them. Each elector was to choose two persons, one of whom could not be from the same state as the elector. And this was to override that tendency, that concern that they have, that people know their local elected officials, people from their home state or people who have been active in politics in their home state, but that they don't know people from other states. And then finally, the Constitution specifies that they're to vote by ballot. And this is an 18th century term that means a private ballot. It means it's written on a piece of paper. And it's worth noting because there was another way of voting at the time called viva voce, live voice. That's the way that members of Congress vote on bills today so that we know how they vote. But the idea here is that the electors are supposed to vote in a secret ballot. And that is so that their vote, they can't be punished for their vote. They can vote knowing that they're making that choice freely. So I think you can see here that these are all factors that they're putting in the Electoral College to minimize this ability for improper influence, for collaboration, and for corruption. So I want to just note that the features of today's Electoral College, awarding a state's electors or electoral votes to the winner of that state's popular vote, are not described in the Constitution. They're also not described in any subsequent amendment. In fact, the Constitution never uses the word electoral votes. The Constitution only talks about electors who are human beings. And I want to also point out that if their plan had been to simply award the state's electoral votes to the winner of the state's popular vote, all the other features that I've just described to you that are in their plan for an electoral college, the exclusion of federal employees meeting together, voting by ballot, those features would all have been unnecessary because electors themselves would have been unnecessary, just as they're actually unnecessary today. All right, so I want to just say a word about what voting for president looked like in the early United States. Note that the Constitution does give the states authority to choose the manner. It gives the legislatures in the states the authority to choose the manner that the electors are chosen. And so there were actually 5 different ways that electors were chosen in the early elections for president in the United States. Sometimes the state legislatures chose electors. Oh, goodness mine, sorry. Sometimes voters chose electors in statewide general elections. Now notice that the voters are choosing electors. They're not voting for candidates. They're voting for electors. Sometimes the voters chose electors in district elections, the way that we choose members of the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives today, the way that Kentucky is now divided into 6 congressional districts. A state would have been divided into electoral districts, and each district would have chosen, again, an elector, not a president. And then obviously those electors go on to elect the president. Others actually use a 2-step process for choosing the electors, where the people vote in a statewide general election, and then the legislature chooses among those top vote getters to choose the electors. And then finally, in New Jersey, the governor and his privy council chose the electors. So I think you can see that in the first scenario where the state legislatures are choosing electors, and in the last scenario where the governor and his privy council are choosing electors, there's no popular participation in this process at all. And I'll just note that South Carolina actually used the mode of the state legislature choosing the electors until after the Civil War. So no South Carolinian, except the few electors, participated in this process at all till after the Civil War. So how did this process change? Well, it changes quite early on, and it does this because right from the very beginning, from the very first several elections, we see exactly the kind of electoral strategizing and conspiring, really, that the framers sought to exclude from the Electoral College. They really thought that they had made a situation where that couldn't happen, but it happens almost immediately. And it's interestingly enough, Alexander Hamilton is one of the first people who participates in this kind of trying to influence electors to vote for certain people. And one of the first ways that this begins to happen is that the electors start to pledge in advance for whom they will vote. And we saw this as early as the third presidential election in 1796. And in fact, it is why Thomas Jefferson didn't win in 1796, because a potential elector, an elector who was running to be an elector, promised that he was going to vote for John Adams, and actually won that district. That was a situation where Virginia had district elections. And so he cost Thomas Jefferson the presidency in 1796. And I want you to notice what I've got here. These are electoral tickets. This is one from the 1824 election, where you see the candidates at the top, but then it tells you, if you want Henry Clay to be, do you want to vote for Henry Clay? Well, if you're in this district, you should vote for Eli Todd. So it tells you which elector to vote for, because that's the name that's going to be on your ballot. If you want a certain presidential candidate, because these are men who have pledged in advance for whom they will vote. There's one from 1824. And by the way, the parties would print these up in advance. And that's how we got this word, calling them tickets. Which ticket are you running on? That's where that language comes from. These were called tickets. Here's one from 1848 on the left of your screen, and one from, I believe, 1852, yes, on the right of your screen. Again, this is for, I believe, I need to put my glasses on to see which state this would be. I think it's Virginia. Yes, Virginia. Yes, so it says at the top, Virginia. And the one on the right, I think, is possibly Connecticut or Rhode Island. And then finally, here's one from the last election before Lincoln, 1856, where you see the electors named there. So this is what voting for a president looked like in the first half of the 19th century. So this process, this plan of saying in advance who you were going to vote for was very well established and happened pretty early on. But there is also the district versus the general ticket. So it was fairly widely agreed that dividing the states into districts was the fairest way for the Electoral College to work, so that you voted for an elector from your district. But some states would make a general election for electors. But district voting actually allowed the state to choose electors that were, if a certain party dominated in one district a little bit more, it would make a more nuanced sort of choice. And so states actually would switch back and forth for different elections to maximize their advantage. For example, Virginia used the district election in 1796, and it cost them Thomas Jefferson in the presidency. So for the election of 1800, the legislature switched the rules and made a general ticket, because they knew that Jefferson was so popular in the state that he would win the whole state. And so that is partly how Jefferson won the presidency in 1800. And so this general ticket actually morphed into this thing called winner take all, where the states began to award all their electors to whoever won the popular vote, or excuse me, to the candidate, to the single highest vote getter, the electors that represented the single highest vote getter, because what they wanted to do was to maximize their advantage. And so that's exactly what this strategy, winner take all, is calculated to do. And I don't have time to take us all through the 19th century, but winner take all was not formalized in state laws most of the time until the 20th century, when actually, for example, in Kentucky, I believe it was in the 1930s, we put it in a state statutes that our electoral votes will be awarded to the winner of the popular vote. But that is not formalized in any kind of state laws most of the time until the 20th century. So I want to just say a word about how early Americans, experts on the Constitution, viewed these changes to the Electoral College, the changes in practice that I've just described. Madison, writing in 1823, objected to the winner-take-all system and recommended the district voting system. I think these words are very powerful. They come from an expert on the Constitution, Joseph Story. He said the electors are now chosen wholly with reference to particular candidates. And as a result, the whole foundation of the system so elaborately constructed is subverted. Now, Joseph Story was a Supreme Court justice, and this statement comes from his commentaries on the Constitution that he wrote in 1833. And perhaps most compellingly, Rufus King, whom I introduced at the beginning of this presentation, was speaking on a resolution for an amendment to the Constitution that would have altered the Electoral College in 1816. And I want to give you the fuller context of that quote. He said the opinion had been, and so now he's speaking about what they had in mind when they created the Electoral College. They thought the opinion had been that all undue agency or influence was entirely guarded against, that the men selected by the people from their own body would give their votes in such a manner that no opportunity would be afforded for a combination. Now, a combination is the term that they used at the time for winner take all, to change the freedom and alter the popular character, which naturally belong to the electoral body. Such had been the idea at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. We all know the course which this thing has taken. The election of a president of the United States is no longer that process which the Constitution contemplated. In conformity with the original view of the authors of that instrument, I would restore as thoroughly as possible the freedom of election to the people. And I want to just offer one more commentary on the system as it had changed from William Rawle, who was a lawyer who wrote A View of the Constitution in 1825. I believe he also served as Attorney General for the state of New York. It must, however, be acknowledged that in no respect have the enlarged and profound views of those who framed the Constitution, nor the expectations of the public when they adopted it, been so completely frustrated as in the practical operation of the system so far as it relates to the independence of the electors. It was supposed that the election of these two high officers would be committed to men not likely to be swayed by party or personal bias, who would act under no combination with others and be subject neither to intimidation or corruption. The electors publicly pledged themselves to vote for a particular individual, and thus the whole foundation of this elaborate system is destroyed. So, with that background, let's just touch briefly on the Electoral College today. It's really a mere formality. It works really as a mathematical formula that distorts our votes in two ways. Number one, the electors are not allocated proportionally to the population. And then secondly, winner takes all that means that these electors are not awarded proportionally to how the people actually vote. So I'm going to go through this quickly because I see we're at about a quarter to the hour. Electors are not divided proportionally, and I'll just give you the example here of Wyoming with its population of 577,000, and they have 3 electoral votes, one for every 192,579,000 people. 192,579 people. Whereas California, that has 39.5 million people, so 39 million more people than Wyoming, they get 55 electoral votes, or one for every 719,000 people. And so we could express it mathematically like this, that a person in Wyoming, their vote carries 4 times the weight or value of a Californian's vote, almost. Or we could say that a Californian's vote only has about 25% of the value of a person from Wyoming. California would actually require over 200 electoral votes to be equally represented with Wyoming. Winner take all is actually even more distorting than the way that the electors are allocated. Let's go ahead with the example of California with its 55 electoral votes. If the Democratic candidate wins by a margin of 50.1% and therefore gets all 55 electoral votes, that leaves the other 49.9% completely unrepresented. So it is truly as if that 49.9%, their votes are literally erased. They're given to the candidate for whom they did not vote. I hope you can see that. That's what winner take all creates. And I'm going to give an example from the 1960 presidential election of how this misbalance between the electoral vote and the popular vote hinge on this very thing. John F. Kennedy won 303 electoral votes, which is a pretty decisive electoral victory. He got 34,200,000 votes. His opponent, Richard Nixon, in one of the closest elections in our history, got only, a little more than 100,000 less. But look what a difference it made in the Electoral College. So I'll just close by saying that, we have this, some people have argued, well, the Electoral College has worked and have suggested, that it's, why are people all of a sudden bothered by the Electoral College? Well, the truth is Americans have never been satisfied with the Electoral College. There have been over 800 proposals for changing the Electoral College in Congress. More amendments on the Electoral College have been introduced in Congress than on any other subject. And then finally, I'll just end with Joseph Story's words once again: the whole foundation of the system so elaborately constructed is subverted. And with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Wow, thank you. Oh my goodness. That is a far more convoluted story than I certainly realized.
It was for me too, actually. Yeah. I started studying this because I realized I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, well, and that was going to be a question I had for you. How did you get interested in this? My goodness. I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, I had always had certain assumptions, and I don't even know where I got them from, and had just sort of parroted those, and then got into some discussions with some folks who didn't quite see it my way, and I didn't think that they were right, but I couldn't quite defend my position very well, and so I thought, well, I'm just going to start studying this, and I started reading some of the material that has been out there sort of in the popular press about this in the last 4 or 5 years, and realized that not much of that was very well supported. There wasn't well argued or supported, and so I just started digging. And that's the great thing about research, and actually the truth about most things. Once we dig into them more deeply, we almost invariably find that they're more complicated than we had initially thought. And I realized, what's really operative here, because I was trying to talk about the Electoral College based upon the way that the framers had created it. And I think it does give most of us who are interested in being faithful to the Constitution, and I think most Americans are, it gives it extra weight when we think, well, the framers created this, they must have had a certain purpose in mind, and gee, we ought to, my inclination would always be to go with what they had in mind. But I actually realized that we've abandoned what they had in mind 2 centuries ago.
Certainly didn't take very long, did it?
No, it didn't.
Well, thank you. There have been a few questions that the audience submitted here, so I'll just kind of go back through there. But looks like lots of compliments. Wonderful presentation. Julie Sonner asked if the PowerPoint could be available to view later. We are actually going to make this video available on YouTube. So I've been recording. Sorry, I probably should have mentioned that.
That's all right. Okay.
So it certainly will be available, so people can delve into this, certainly. Let's see. I'm trying to get back to the beginning. So Jody Lewis had a question. You mentioned the idea of where they discussed the possibility of each person actually voting for 3 candidates. And she wanted to know, is that much like or equivalent to the ranked choice voting that's becoming very popular?
No, it was not ranked choice. Okay. And I'm honestly trying to remember now what the rationale for the 3 candidates was. And I honestly don't remember in that case. There was always this concern, again, that people would only vote for people from their home state. And that's just repeated over and over. And that, sort of this you have a natural preference for people who are from where you're from. And of course, that was even stronger in the early republic, where identities, people tended to think of themselves, as Virginians, more than Americans, especially, very early on. And so they were trying to overcome that tendency. And I'm trying to remember if there was a requirement that one of those 3 votes would be for someone outside their state. And I just don't remember at this point, but it was not ranked choice, no.
Okay. And Dennis he says, I thought we had been taught in elementary school and high school that the popular vote would allow large populated areas to dominate the elections.
So there is that concern because they only believe that people will vote only for someone from their own state. But what they think is, that the populous states, which would be, at the time, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, I believe, are the top 4. But what they believe is that none of those are going to produce a majority. And I see my son's comment there. I'm happy that my son thinks I'm a rock star. Good boy. That what that will do is to produce 4 candidates, none of whom have a majority. And what's interesting is the argument about the tyranny of the majority often says, well, they didn't want the majority always to get their way, kind of, but that's actually not the case. What they're concerned about, the tyranny of the majority is a legislative problem. It's what legislative majorities do once elected. It's not a problem of how offices are elected. And the framers are actually concerned about when something is really important, that it should have a bigger majority. And that is why, for example, constitutional amendments require a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate and 3/4 of the state. So the bigger the deal is, the bigger a majority that it should have. So it's not about the larger populated areas of the state are going to dominate, because New York is going to vote for New Yorkers, and Massachusetts is going to vote for Massachusetts folks, and Virginians are going to vote for Virginians. So it's more the problem that they won't get a majority out of that. Does that make sense? In other words, they don't believe that Virginians are going to be voting for New Yorkers because Virginians don't know New Yorkers.
Okay.
I hope that answer was clear enough.
Thank you. Dennis also asked, did the framers feel that all people would vote on a regular basis, unlike what we find in today's situation when many people prefer not to be involved in the political process?
Mm-hmm. So there's been some new research about voting in the early republic. And for years we had said that voting rights were actually very limited in the early republic, but we're actually finding that they're quite a lot more broad than we had anticipated, that possibly as many as 80% of free males could vote. Now, they didn't talk so much about, gee, people won't vote, they won't use this privilege, they're apathetic. Those really aren't the conversations that they're having. It's really this concern of how will they make a wise choice? How can people make a wise choice? That's really the concern. And I also need to say that there is an ongoing and vibrant conversation about who should have the right to vote in this period. And the requirements vary greatly from state to state. In some states, you don't actually have to own land, you just own any kind of taxable property. And so that could be, some people maybe owned a slave or two with whom they rented out and made their living by renting out slaves. And they paid taxes on those slaves, but they didn't actually own any land or any real property. So in some states, it was all taxpayers. Some states, they reduced the land requirement to very low numbers. They had conversations about, in some states, about anyone who had served in the military should be entitled to vote. So that it's a very fluid kind of conversation. And most states initially don't necessarily exclude people of color. And only, and New Jersey actually enfranchises women for certain kinds of elections. Now, what's interesting is, I know we love the narrative of progress in American history, but it's not a clean line of progress, because as voting rights widen for white males, they get taken away from free people of color, and even those limited voting rights for women get taken away. So it's not exactly the question you asked. Sorry.
So Janet wondered, who are the electors exactly? Like who are these folks that we're, because I don't know who the electors are from Kentucky. So that's definitely a good question.
Yeah. So they tend to be what we would call local notables. This is a term that historians have used. So local people of influence, and perhaps they had served in state government, which was, it's sort of the idea that you do want people of influence and knowledge, because they would know something about these people and their qualifications. I know that when the South Carolina legislature appointed the first electors, these were all people that anyone who studied the Constitution would be familiar with. And I believe that it's people like, I can't remember the exact names, but they were names all familiar to me, like Thomas Pinckney, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, possibly Henry Laurens. So those sorts of folks. So in Virginia, it tends to be large landowners. In Kentucky, and I don't remember which election, but Isaac Shelby, our first governor, I believe in about maybe possibly the election of 1800, I saw where he had offered himself as an elector. So he was an elector. So.
Okay. Is that still true today? Like local notables, or like
I believe the parties pick them. Parties pick them. So they tend to be people who've been active in party politics.
I see. Okay. No worry about corruption there. Anyway.
Well, or just the fact that they're chosen completely with respect to party, which, as we saw the statement, I forget now who it was, who said that the idea is that they would be chosen without respect to party. They're chosen now completely completely by party.
Interesting. And let's see. Larry says, it seems the problem lies mostly with how each state is allocated their number of electoral votes. How is that determined?
Yeah, and so this is a good question, and this has remained. This is one way, that is consistent with the Constitution. When it was designed, the numbers of electors, and I don't even like to say electoral votes because it's electors, was to be equal to the numbers of members of Congress, and it still is. But if you think about it, when they were going to have Congress elect the president, they just duplicated Congress in the Electoral College. It is an ad hoc temporary Congress, but it doesn't have the problems of Congress, or so they thought. So it exactly mimics it in its composition in terms of representation from each state.
Interesting. And I'm really
Yeah,
embarrassed
go
that
ahead.
I got to 40 years old and I didn't know that. Here we go.
Many people don't know that, but yeah, that's how it's done. You get the same number of electors as you have representatives in Congress.
Okay.
So,
Margaret asked about, and you may have kind of addressed this, about what percentage of eligible voters participated in early elections compared with today's turnout.
oh, um, I actually can't answer that question because, so first off, realizing that in many states, the people don't actually get to participate, right? When the state legislatures are choosing the electors, the people don't participate in that. It's the state legislature that does it. And so, you know, that the states that choose that way diminish as time goes on. But in those early elections, I saw a statistic somewhere that it was about 7% of Americans participated in the first presidential election. But keep in mind, you know, that there are 13 states, but about 5 of them choose by state legislature. I think it's North Carolina that doesn't even get its act together to send electors for that first one. So it's actually really a pretty small percentage, but yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sorry, I can't answer it. I believe that participation in the mid 19th century is higher, but again, it's only men who are white men really who are able to vote. And I believe at that time a higher percentage vote, but most political scientists believe that the Electoral College actually suppresses turnout because it leads people who want to vote for, if they're going to vote for the person that they know is not going to win their state, then they believe that their vote doesn't count. Oh, and it could also work for those on the other side too. You know, it's a foregone conclusion who will win a state in many states. And so it discourages turnout.
Interesting. Let's see here.
I might also add that it discourages the rise of third parties. That this is one of the reasons that our two-party system, some people would use the word is so stable, others might say it's so rigid. It's almost impossible to run a third-party candidate. And what's interesting is Americans complain all the time about a two-party system and only having 2 choices, but yet we have this system that prevents us from having other viable choices.
Greg asked, how about the quote, protect rural Americans argument that we hear about, I guess, in favor of the Electoral College?
Well, so there's nothing in terms of what the framers were trying to do that suggested they were trying to protect rural Americans, because America was rural when this thing was designed. So, you know, that's certainly not part of the equation. I would say that, you know, the electoral in states that are largely rural voters are favored, and it works against both parties, you know, just depending on which state you're in. The Electoral College will, that's not a function of the Electoral College. That is a function of our society becoming more urbanized, you know, so that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. Jody has another question. She's curious about Dr. Dupont's opinion on whether the framers' attitudes and attempts to prevent intimidation and corruption was naive or just reflective of a different time.
Oh, you know, gosh, I don't know the answer to that question. I hate to call them naive because I think they actually are very savvy about human nature, and they talk over and over again about you know, that anyone can be corrupted. You know, this is a big concern. So I don't think they're necessarily naive. I think perhaps, you know, this was a new device and they didn't foresee the particular ways it would be corrupted. I also, gosh, I had a thought that just fleeted right through my head that was pertinent to that, and now I can't remember it. Yeah, so I hate to call them naive. I know what one of the things I was going to say. There are a lot of comments in the drafting of the Constitution. They were both hopeful and fearful at the same time. And it strikes me, you know, there's a quote by Benjamin Franklin that is often quoted at the end of the Constitutional Convention. He comments on the sun that's carved into the back of the chair that Washington is sitting in. And he says, I've wondered if it was a rising or a setting sun. And now I know it's a setting sun. And so people love to quote that statement from Franklin. But it wasn't much before that he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he said, this thing's going to last a couple of generations and then it's going to devolve into corruption. So I think that's kind of one of, they were hopeful, but not completely, they weren't saying, oh boy, man, this is going to last for the ages. There's no way around it. They didn't have that attitude.
Dennis agrees. He says hopeful and fearful is a good way to put it, and that the point seems to stand out to him that the concern by the framers about corruption and who would be, quote, smart enough to be voters. And sadly, we as a country haven't gotten past that point.
Well, and I want to say, again, it's less about smarts as adequate information, that their concern, who was going to be adequately informed. Because the 18th century information travels slowly and it doesn't travel as far as it does today. And I mean, we have the opposite concern today about bad information, erroneous information, false information.
It's a really interesting kind of paradox,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Gosh. Well, thank you again. I think we've gone through all of the comments and questions that we had in the chat. As I mentioned, we are going to make this available on YouTube, so you can look at it again. Please tell your friends as well if anybody has questions or wants to learn more about this topic, especially as we are about 30 days out from the election. Please encourage them to take a look.
32, but who's counting?
So thank you again, and do please join us next month. We are going to be hearing from Barry Craig about Kentuckians who served at Pearl Harbor. So come on back next month and we will see you again. Thanks, guys. We'll see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Dupont.
Oh, thank you. What a good audience and what fun.
Yes, great questions. Great questions. I'm glad we
did. They were.
So,
they were. Great.
Thank you again. I would love to hear more about your research on religion and civil rights and white supremacy. So I may have to hit you up about that sometime.
I love to talk about it. So
thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.